Welcome back. Big labor unions backed by Joe Biden take aim at right-to-work laws. One America's John Hines spoke with the president of the National Right-to-Work Committee and has more from Washington.
Mark, I know you're the president of the National Right-to-Work Committee. Of course, there is some legislation called the Right-to-Work Act, I believe. Why is this significant, perhaps, at this point in time?
This is the National Right to Work Act, introduced last Wednesday by Senator Rand Paul and Joe Wilson, is a single one-page bill that doesn't add a single word to federal law, but it goes back into 1930 statutes that were passed during the Roosevelt administration that basically allowed the federal government.
And this is called the National Right to Work Act. Is that the right?
That's the title Right to Work Act.
The National Right to Work Act. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And this bill is a simple one-page bill that simply deletes provisions of the National Labor Relations Act passed in 1935 that allow union officials to have a worker fired if they don't tender dues or fees, and that's just outrageous. This federal law has been in place for all these years, and it gives union officials unique privileges to compel someone to pay dues or fees to get or keep a job. The National Right to Work Act would change that. It simply goes into the federal statute, and it changes the bias of compulsion to voluntarism. It simply says that workers would have the choice. If they choose, they can join a union, participate in a union in any way they see fit, as long as they choose to do it. But they can't be compelled to pay dues or fees to keep their jobs. It's really that simple, John.
How does this relate to national right-to-work laws already in place in, I think it's 27 states or so across the nation? How does this relate to what's going on now in right-to-work states?
In 1947, Congress came back and they passed an amendment to the original Wagner Act. This is all now wound up in what we call the National Labor Relations Act. But in 47, they passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which basically said if states, by affirmative vote, could outlaw the closed shop, i.e. the idea that you have to join and pay dues to a union, then states would have the privilege to do that. It's a federally granted privilege to the states to actually outlaw this compulsory union scheme that was created in 1935. So, if Congress simply went in and took away that language in the 1947 amendment in the Taft-Hartley Act, then states would no longer have the ability to have right-to-work laws. All the right-to-work laws, the 27, as you correctly state, would be eliminated, and no state could go forward and pass a right-to-work law because that would be preempted by the federal government. So that's how the federal government kind of exerts their power over the states. They gave them the privilege to pass right-to-work laws, but they can also take it away.
But now Senator Paul and Joe Wilson in the House have this Right-to-Work Act that they've introduced. So if this were implemented, would it basically eviscerate right-to-work laws currently in 27 states and replace it with a national right-to-work law? How would that work?
That's right. So in the Roosevelt administration, they used this federal preemption, this notion that the federal government would apply all this to the country and say that forced unionism is perfectly fine. What Senator Paul and Congressman Joe Wilson's bill does, it simply goes in to the federal labor policy, again, doesn't add a single word to federal law. It simply repeals the language that allows union officials to have a worker fired if they don't tender dues or fees. So what it does, it takes the bias of federal law that is currently in favor of forced unionism, compulsory unionism, and it says it's going to be voluntary.
Mark Mix, president of the National Right to Work Committee, thank you for talking to us on One America News. Good to catch up with you, sir.
Thank you, John. Thanks for the opportunity.